Hi class, our third presentation will actually consist of two separate lectures. The first is wet collodion and mid-19th century processes, and the second is early portraiture. So the problem facing photographers in the 1850s was that you had the choice of two photographic processes at your hand, but neither one was refined enough to be quite perfect enough. The daguerreotype, number one, is incredibly sharp and it produces one-of-a-kind images, meaning that you really can't make duplications of it. Or we had the collotype. Now the collotype was great, but it had fuzzy images, but you could make multiple copies of it, which was kind of beneficial, right? If you wanted two copies of your husband or your child. So what would be the solution? Wet plate collodion negatives. That's the solution. It was invented in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer. He's a British sculptor and photographer. He's an artist. He allowed negatives to develop on glass plates. So these negatives on glass could be used multiple times as long as you didn't break it, right? And they were very, very sharp. The only downsides are that it had to be prepared, exposed, and developed all while wet. So you spread a chemical on and usually you let it dry so you could handle it more easily, the negative. But in this case, it has to be still wet. So it's time sensitive because it's going to start drying. So that's why we call it wet plate photography. And it's also very overly sensitive to blue light. All right, so we have skylight, which is blue. Oh, so anything you take a landscape, the result is going to be that it's blank. All right, the sky is going to look just pure white. It gave rise to travel photography, though, despite that, because you can now take these negatives on the road with you, mix them up real quick, take a picture, and you now have this negative that when you get back to wherever you're going, you can make a print from, many prints from. So here's an example of a wet plate collodion negative. Now you can just see from this example how sharp it is. There's clean lines everywhere. You see details of her face. Now this is a piece of glass, so you do have to be careful with it. You don't want to drop it. So let's talk about these technical advances. So in 1851, Frederick Scott Archer published his wet collodion process, which is used on glass plates, also ambrotypes and tintypes, and they all create sharper negatives than those before, collotypes, even daguerreotypes. Daguerreotypes were very, very sharp, but the problem was you couldn't reproduce them. We're also going to talk about later stereoscopes, and they came into a great popularity in the 1850s when they could be mass-produced as albumin prints from negatives. We'll talk about those a little later. So let's talk about Frederick Scott Archer. Now he and his process of collodion made a better negative. It made a negative on glass. All right, Talbot, his collotypes, they were blurry, they were made on paper. Yes, you can reproduce them, but not to a great extent. Daguerreotypes were sharp, pristine, but you couldn't make multiples. Collodion, which Frederick Scott Archer created, is a material. It's made by dissolving a form of gun cotton in ether and potassium iodide. Now, I don't expect you to know these chemical names. I'm just telling you what they are made by. The emulsion that he creates is now poured onto a glass plate. And after that ether is evaporated into the air, But while the plates are still wet, you have to take the picture. And immediately after taking the picture, you have to develop it, okay? After that, you had a beautiful negative on glass. And this collodion negative was sharp and it had subtle tones created to it. It was a very good negative that you can make many, many reproductions from. So now we have this collodion process. People are excited. They can make as many images that they want with it. Other people started to experiment. So we have a French photographer, Adolphe Mardin, and he was the first to use tin to make a negative. So he poured that collodion material onto a piece of tin, so a piece of metal instead of the glass. Now that process is called a tintype. These tintypes were extremely popular. So now let's talk about photographers that are benefiting from this collodion process. Here we have Francis Frith, and he was from 1822 to about 1898. So he had a lot of money, Frith, and he set out in the second half of the 1850s to create a series of expeditions. He wanted to document sites in the Holy Land and in Egypt. He wanted to show pyramids, etc. to the masses. He created more than 500 unique images that were published as stereographic views and mammoth plate prints. These mammoth plate prints were 17 by 18 inches on glass. Imagine, to be very careful with that. And he established his reputation as one of the leading photographers of his day. So these stereographic prints, I'll show you some examples of them later, were great examples of travel photography. People wanted to look through these stereographic cameras, and you'll know why in a few slides. But let's look at the pictures created by Francis Frith. Here we have the pyramids of Dashur from the east in 1859. Now this is an album print from a wet collodion negative, okay? And now this is showing people things that they might never have seen before, right? And from other places. Here we have the Great Pyramid and the Great Sphinx, all right? In 1858 he took this. And it has so much detail. And for the first time people were able to see this, to see these wonders of the world, not from drawings and paintings, but from photographs, and photographs that they might be able to purchase themselves and keep and frame it like a postcard. So now I'm just going to scroll through a bunch more of his images, take a look at them, stop, pause it if you want to look closely. They're very detailed views of places in Egypt and the Middle East. So as I said before, the wet collodion technique, it required quick on-site preparation that we had to, as photographers, do before the plate dried, right? We had to take a picture quickly and develop it right after. You couldn't wait till you were at, back at your hotel afterwards to develop it. You had to do it on site. And this made it very difficult under the circumstances being in the desert for him. But he was able to do this. As I said before, he had some money, so he was able to create a little dark room for himself wherever he went and create these images and develop them. He was a master of composition, but he also staged his photographs. So he was great at deciding where in the photo an image should be. Let's say that Great Sphinx. Should it be on the right of the photo? Should it be on the left of the photo? Sometimes in the photos you see people, and most of the time he actually got those people to walk where he wanted to. And they showed scale, and they showed maybe the viewer a different view that he wanted to tell, a story to tell. But mostly in these photographs was scale. He wanted those people specifically in the place that he told them to stand or walk because he wanted to show how big these monuments were. He created Francis Firth & Co., and it became the largest photographic printing company in England. And his photographs, almost all of them, were the Egyptian images, were taken by other people and stamped by Firth. So some of these, not all of them, were maybe taken by somebody else that he trained, of course, that his company trained, but they were taken and produced under his name. So this freedom of taking a photograph where you're traveling and showing these remote locations to masses became popular in the 1850s and on. So we have Auguste Rosalie Besson here. And he was the first person to photograph from the summit of Mont Blanc in 1862. No one had seen this view before. And it took 3 attempts and 25 porters to help carry his equipment. So he had a large team of people with him. Very interesting, right? Climbing and holding onto his equipment in packs and setting up where he needed to develop and print. So this trek by Besson's team was a tough one. It was bitterly cold. There were snowstorms, avalanches, okay? And also it was a high altitude exploration. So that causes nausea and vertigo symptoms for people. So when his team reached the 15,781 foot summit on July 25th, 1861, Besson only got to expose 3 negatives. So after he got those 3 negatives that he wanted so badly on the top of the mountain, his other goal was to take a picture of the team and him walking up the summit. So on their descent back down, he stopped and he posed them. And you can actually see in the slide before, if you want to go back to it and zoom in, or look on another website and zoom in, you can see their tracks, all right, that they had already reached the top and were going back down at that point, and then pretended to be climbing back up again. So here we have Samuel Bourne, 1834 to about 1912. And he's a commercial photographer based in colonial India. And he embarked on a perilous expedition, actually many perilous expeditions, from about 1863 to 66. And he had also large convoys of servants loaded with bulky equipment that helped him with these travel pictures. And he gave the public the first real glimpse of very remote areas of the Himalayas. Here we see the view of Wanga Valley in India in 1863. And now this is an album print on paper made from that wet collodion glass plate negative. It's beautiful. So now let's talk about those stereoscopes I mentioned earlier and how they were created and why they were created. So stereoscopes are the first virtual reality of the time. Okay, it gave you, when you're looking through the viewer, a 3D effect, right? which was fantastic for the general population to finally see something in a 3D format, it looked like it was right in front of you. So how they achieved that was it's a camera with two lenses. Now these two lenses are side by side, but they take the same photo of an image at a slightly different angle. So when you view the two negatives or prints together in front of you with a little magnifying viewer that enlarged it for you, you were able to feel like you were in the scene. It looked sort of like a 3D picture in front of you. And they gained really great popularity in the 1850s. People loved them, of course, right? You can buy a travel stereoscope set of pictures and look at all these fantastic views of the pyramids in Egypt and feel like you're there, kind of. So these stereoscopes not only were perfect for travel photography, they were for a lot of other things. Humorous photography, right? There was a lot of things, little plays that people produced and made many, many different pairs of these images, which kind of told a funny story. And you flipped through them and you got to see a little comedy. There was also risque photographs, okay, that maybe were nudes of women, men, etc. And they look 3D. So when you're looking through them, it looked like you were a voyeur looking at someone's bedroom. All right. So these things, these photos, and these viewers were incredibly popular to buy. Middle class households loved them. So here we see a camera, an example of a stereoscope camera. Here, 1857, this was produced. It's a beautiful camera. See these two lenses? Close, very close to one another, but they produce a slightly different angle, which makes it look like a 3D effect. Here we see a photograph that has a deeper meaning. Photographers wanted to portray images that told a little bit of a story. Here we have Thomas Richard Williams' The Sands of Time. It's a human skull in there, so that represents death. There's an hourglass with which the sand is running out. There's a compass. There's a book that's been abandoned. Eyeglasses just thrown on the page. So this image evokes a temporary nature of mortal life. It shows how death is inevitable, right? The objects can refer to intellectual pursuits, reading, etc., and the triumph over the soul over the mind. This image evokes the temporary nature of our life, right? You see this, it's definitely clear with this. So here we have a nude. It's it harkens to the classical paintings of the past. We see a very typical classical pose, a reclining nude, placed onto this like bed chaise lounge sort of a thing. And this is from Felix Jacques Moulin. So this image by William England is an image of a man that's crossing Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And this was a kind of a big deal that this man was doing this at the time. This was 1858. It was kind of like in the news and everything like that. So people loved seeing it. Obviously, they couldn't be there to see it, and there was no news recordings of it. So they ended up buying a stereograph photo. And this photo was one of the most popular stereographic images of all time. It sold over more than 100,000 copies. I have mentioned albumin prints earlier in this presentation, so let's talk about albumin prints. This is another technical advancement of the mid-19th century in photography. So it's a print made using a coated paper with albumin, and it's most popular between 1850 and about 1900. So a paper was coated with a thin layer. Now albumin is an egg white solution. It contains salt and it's sensitized with a silver nitrate compound. So it's then printed using daylight under a negative. So daylight, you can have a glass negative that's put on top of the paper that's coated with this chemical and put it outside. The daylight will expose the image onto the paper, and then you can go develop it with some developer and fixer, and that will keep the image onto the paper. So the resulting paper had a smooth surface with a fine sheen from those egg whites, okay? Kind of like when you egg white a pie before you put it in the oven on the crust. You put a little bit of egg whites. It makes that crust really golden and shiny. So you have that shine on the paper too. Albumin prints could be toned with a gold solution, and it gave a rich purplish brown color to the image. It also reduced that risk of fading. So you'll see some of these images that I'll show you that have this nice golden cast to it. So now we have James Ambrose cutting, and he patented the ambrotype process in 1854. Ambrotypes reached the height of their popularity in the mid-1850s to mid-1860s until those carte de visites and other paper print photographs that you can make multiple copies from replaced them. An ambrotype consists of an underexposed glass negative placed on a dark background. This dark backing material creates a positive image. It's less expensive than daguerreotypes because they were faster and cheaper to make, and they finally replaced them in the 1850s. Highlights become soft and pearly in tone, as opposed to daguerreotypes, which are very clear and crisp. Photographers often applied pigments to the surface of the plate to add color, tinting cheeks, adding red to lips, adding gold highlights to jewelry, buttons, belt buckles. Ambrotypes were sold in either cases, like we're going to see in the next few slides, or ornate frames to enhance their presentation and protect the glass negative. So tintypes. Tintypes were originally known as ferrotypes. They were invented in the mid-1850s by Adolphe Alexandre Mardin, and they continued to be produced well into the 20th century. What happens is a photographic emulsion was applied directly to a thin sheet of iron, which was coated with a dark lacquer or enamel, which it was able to produce a positive image instantly. Although the resulting images were less crisp than a daguerreotype, tintypes became popular. They had a quick processing time. So they made kind of an instant photo, and photographers could sell these tintype portraits at fairs and carnivals. In about 10 or 15 minutes, people could take a picture and then bring it home with them. Like the ambrotype, tintypes often were hand painted. Customers purchased cases and frames to display them in. So let's talk about the invention of the tintype and this quick instant photo. Quick meaning 10 or 15 minutes. It allowed Civil War photographers like Matthew Brady, which I'll show you a few pictures from in the next slide, to be able to take pictures out in the field easily, quickly. And the lightweight, unbreakable nature of that piece of tin instead of glass meant that the soldiers were able to mail portraits back to their loved ones. Here's a tintype that was sold in 2011 for $2.3 million. We're not sure if it's Matthew Brady or not who took it, but it's worth so much because it's the only known photographic image of Billy the Kid, the famous outlaw. So now let's look at more current photographers who are using older methods like this to create new work. Here we have Joni Sternbach, and she's creating images of surfers around the country using a large format camera and tintypes, Civil War era tintypes. Now these pictures are beautiful, but they're distinctly modern. So when she was asked about her process and why she started doing this, she said, "I was more interested in creating a new topic of conversation about how can we use the materials and information from history, the history of photography, to make new and wonderful images that we haven't seen before." She actually started this series back in 2002 when she was shooting a different project in Montauk, New York. So let's conclude this presentation with Sally Mann, who created a series of self-portraits starting in 2006. Now these portraits were made using the wet collodion process. Now they're quite beautiful. I have two videos to show you. You'll be able to click on links in the homework section. And there's one about Sally Mann and her making these. Now, and there's another one about the process of wet collodion. And you can see in detail how it is actually done. It's very interesting.